Hi, this is Tyson. I'm talking through the JavaScript basics, and today we're looking at arrays and different ways you can iterate over them and do things with arrays. So first of all, we're going to look at while loops. So we jump into this. We're creating an array called artist. And an array is basically just a collection of multiple things. So you could have like an array that contains strings, like this one here. They're just different artist names, or you could have an array that contains objects, or you could have, which an object could have like a name and an ID or whatever, or you could have an array of numbers. You could even have an array of arrays. So arrays are just kind of a very versatile kind of data set that has each item in it has an index, and so you can reference it by the index. So, if I wanted to get the artist with an ID with the index of 0, I would just basically do artist 0, and that would give me the first artist in the array. So here we're creating this variable called I, and we started out with the I being 0, and then in the while loop, every time we invoke this while loop, we check whether I is less than the artist length, and if it is, then we continue to call it and recall it. But every time that we go through the loop, we're actually adding on I plus plus. So every time the I is actually incrementing to the next number. So first it's 1, then it's 2, and then it's 3. And by the time it's 3, it's more than the artist length, and so it'll stop and won't be logging anymore. And this can be a little error prone because sometimes you can mistype something, and this condition will never be satisfied, and so that of course will cause an error for you, because it'll continue to try to create this, and you'll have a performance error, and eventually it'll just crash your program. So not the best, but there are certainly instances where the while loop is the best tool in your toolbox. Next, we have the for loop. It's kind of similar to the while loop, except instead of creating a condition to be satisfied, it's just saying for every time. So we're going to create like this variable I, kind of like we did with the while loop, and then we check whether the condition is satisfied, and then we have our iterator. So at the end, we're just like adding plus plus to it, and you can even do it backwards. If we start at like if we wanted to go backwards through an array, we could do a minus minus, kind of the same way. So every time that it goes through the array, it's console logging the artist at the index that it's at, and that's pretty similar to the while loop, but it's more suited for arrays, whereas the while loop could be more suited towards things other than arrays as well. So now we're going to get into some of the array prototype methods, and these are a lot more useful for functional programming and for doing things in a more functional way. So here we have the for each method on the array. So this will go through every single record on the array, and it will give you the item in the array, which in this case is our artist, and so we're just logging each one of those one after the other. You can also get the index off of it, so if we do this and we get the I, and then we'll add that, and so this will say 0, 1, and 2, which is the index of each of the records in the array. So moving on, we have array map. Map on face value, map looks kind of similar to for each, but map, you're expecting to return something. So what map does basically is you give it an array, and then it returns a new array, but modified with whatever has changed inside of the map. So here we're taking the artist, and we're adding an exclamation point to the end of every artist. So we have this const that we create called exclaimed artist, and so we could even add more exclamation points, and so this is basically just taking every single record, and on the record is returning. This is like an implicit return because we're using an arrow function, and so we're just returning that artist, but in a modified way. And you could do a lot of things with this. Like for example, if we wanted to change this into an object instead of a string, what we could do is we could do name, take the artist, and now it's an object with a property of name on each record. So there's a lot of things you can do with map. It's a super useful function on the array. Next we have filter. It's another array prototype method. So what filter does is it basically it loops through everything in the same way that for each and map does, but it expects you to return either true or false on every single record that it gives you. And if you return true, then it keeps that record in the array. And if you return false, then it will exclude that from the array. And so here we're saying if the artist that we're currently looking at includes the word the, then we're going to return true, or a truthy boolean. And so then if it's false, then of course it'll return false. So we could even do something like turn this to lowercase and turn that to lowercase d. And now we get the two different artists that have the, even though they're in different cases because we lowercased it. And so this is, you can do a lot of things with filter just to drill down your data set into exactly what you need to be working with. So last of all, we have the array reduce method. This is kind of the more lower level method on an array, but it's something that's super useful for a lot of reasons. So what it does basically is you get you call .reduce just like you would call any of the other array methods, and then the first argument you get back in the function is the previous thing that's returned from it. So every time that this method is called, it returns a previous value, and so you can work with that previous value and then tack more stuff onto it or remove stuff from it or whatever you want to do with it. And so and then the next argument you get is the actual array element, and then the third argument you get is the index or the key. And so you also can define a initial value. So here I'm defining our initial value. So what we're doing is we're taking this array and we're going to turn it into an object. So I define the initial value as just an empty object, and then every time that we loop over another artist, we're returning a new object, but we're spreading the previous object over it. So the first time it's going to be an empty object that's spread over this new object, and we're adding a property with a key. We're just creating the key from the index, and then we're putting the artist name on it. And then the next time it'll already have the first key. So the first time it went through and put flight of the Concords. Second time it will need a second key, so we'll get the killers. And the third time Weezer, but it's spread over a new object that it's creating every time is based off of the previous object. And if you think about it, the array reduce method can actually be used for you could do mapping, you could do filtering, you could do all the things you do with the other convenience methods on the array. You could actually do all those things with reduce. But since it's such a lower level array operator, it's usually better to use the higher level things like map and filter and for each if you can, because this takes a little more cognitive overload to think about what the previous item in the array is and things like that. So, but there are definitely some really great use cases for using array reduce. So that's basically the different ways you can use arrays. And check out my next video, and we'll talk about how you can do different conditionals and how you can think about branching your code and using it in different ways.